Well, tonight I'm going to skip to Chapter 8 of Slavoj Zizek's The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. It's a chapter entitled The Wire, or What to Do in Non-Evental Times. The Wire is an HBO series that ran for 5 seasons between 2002 and 2008. It was based on stories written by David Simon, and it was based in Baltimore. I've watched this show through one time, and the feeling that it gave me was one of layers. Each new season depicts the same sort of problems from different angles, from the crime on the streets to the crime in the boardrooms and the crime in elected and official offices. By the end of watching all 5 seasons, you have a pretty good idea of how all of these institutions in the city of Baltimore work together to basically not solve anything. Here are the layers. So the first season concentrates on depicting the inner city poor, particularly the drug dealers and their run-ins with the police and the police attempt to try to catch them, and not just the ringleaders, but the guys that are selling drugs on the corner. The second season concentrates on blue-collar workers at the port, and it shows you how the disintegration of the working class, due to changes in capitalism, but also due to corruption on the part of union bosses and politicians, has led to the kind of poverty and social breakdown that leads to crime. And then the third season focuses in on the politicians and bureaucrats in the city, and depicts the futility of political solutions to these problems. The fourth season focuses on the education system and a particular teacher and his experience of it, and it seems as though he's got excellent intentions and really wants to help his students, but he's basically fighting the entire education system to do that. And then the final season deals with the news media, and as Zizek points out, it asks, why is the public not adequately informed about all of these things? When the show moves to a new layer, it doesn't leave behind the old ones, so you get to see how these successive layers of institutions deal with each other and how they reflect back on the original problem that's depicted in the first season. Violent inner-city crime, drug dealers, addictions, etc. So Zizek points out that, of course, The Wire alludes to a bugging device which the police use to try to catch the ringleader, but also it alludes to the inviolate boundary between the two Americas. There's the people who hang out in the projects and who live a life where they feel like they, of necessity, need to get involved in crime because there doesn't seem to be any other opportunity. And the people on the other side of the tracks, so to speak, that don't really ever go there and don't understand what that reality is like. Zizek says one America stands for the horror of addiction and consumption, while in the other, reality is carefully screened. We find out later, screened by the news media, among other things, by the politicians, by the education system. So there's this huge divide that's depicted that makes it much harder for people in the city to actually solve the problems that they complain about. Zizek quotes David Simon, the author, saying that The Wire is a Greek tragedy in which the postmodern institutions are the Olympian forces. It's the police department, or the drug economy, or the political structures, or the school administration, or the macroeconomic forces that are throwing the lightning bolts and hitting people in the ass for no reason. He says, over the last few years, we do indeed seem to have witnessed the rise of a new form of prosopopoeia, where the thing that which speaks is the market itself, increasingly referred to as if it were a living entity that reacts, warns, makes its opinions clear, etc., up to and including demanding sacrifices in the manner of an ancient pagan god. To take just a couple of examples from recent media reports, quote, when the government announced its measures to combat the deficit, the market reacted cautiously, and, quote, the recent fall of the Dow Jones signals a clear warning that the market is not so easily satisfied. More sacrifices will be necessary. That is curious. And I can attest to the fact that The Wire makes a person feel as though these big impersonal institutions and forces make it impossible for good people to have any sort of good effect and force good people to sometimes, in fact often, do bad things. Zizek says that the show depicts those who are actually trying to solve problems as the greatest threat to this machine. And he points out the ironic truth that there is a sense in which the police department, for instance, depends on crime continuing, and politics depends on self-interest and corruption to drive it. And so the implication is when an individual like McNulty decides to try to do something right, solve a crime, for instance, nobody really wants to support that, and he becomes frustrated because he thinks that's his job, but he's not able to do his job. Of course, those kinds of frustrations lead the audience to wonder, well, what is the purpose of the institution? In this case, the police department. What is its real purpose? And maybe that purpose is different from fighting crime, ultimately, or maybe solving crime would be a better way to put that. And then Zizek points out that within all this futility, we see in The Wire these utopian visions that oftentimes these individuals put out into the world as an alternative, a sort of nascent alternative to the existing system. And he gives a bunch of examples, but here's a few. He says, for instance, in season 2, Frank Sobotka uses drug trade money to build up his own contacts in view of his ultimate project, which is the rebuilding and revitalization of the port of Baltimore. Zizek points out that this reflects this working class or blue-collar nostalgia for a type of economy that is not coming back, but is often wished for. Bring back the coal mines, bring back, in this case, the thriving port. We see a young man who's involved in selling drugs have an attack of conscience when he's convinced by the police that his crew is responsible for killing a father of 2. At one point, the police chief, in effect, decriminalizes the drug trade by basically deciding not to go after street-level drug trade, and actually things start to change, and the police are able to refocus for a time. But of course, then that kind of goes by the wayside. The teacher, as I've mentioned before, is constantly trying to fight the system in defense of the students that he thinks he should be giving an education to. And the police detective, who's kind of at the center of the show, actually towards the end creates a fictional serial killer to draw media attention to the police department so that hopefully it can get the support to do its mission. Because he still wants to solve the original crime that the show starts out with. But these utopian visions and the attempts that are sometimes made to do the right thing never actually seem to be able to change anything, and that makes them appear heroic but also existential. I mean by that it seems as though the people are doing these things for their own sake because they are the right thing to do, but without the expectation that anyone else will necessarily recognize that, follow that, or change anything as the result of that. At least looking at it from the outside as a viewer, it seems as though they're expressing their own character in moments when they do the right thing or try to, but they don't express any confidence or hope that their actions will ultimately change anything. And at any rate, the storyline shows that these individual efforts are not enough. Zizek says The Wire is a whodunit in which the culprit is the social totality, the whole system, not an individual criminal or group of criminals. And this is why you get this sense of futility when watching the individuals try to do something. Zizek then backs out from the story a bit, and he applies it's the feeling that it conveys to the capitalist system as a whole. And he says the fate of whole strata of the population, and sometimes of whole countries, can be decided by the solipsistic speculative dance of capital, which pursues its goal of profitability and blessed indifference as to how its movements might affect social reality. Remember a couple of videos ago I mentioned that Zizek said that the economic system appears opaque to people. When the crash happened in 2008, the system and the reasons for the crash appeared opaque, and that this was a sort of monstrous quality of it. And then I like this statement because I think that we don't normally think of it this way, but perhaps it would be good to stretch our minds to think of it this way. Now, when I read this quote, I want people to understand Zizek and everybody else knows that capitalism isn't the only system that commits violence. But that doesn't mean that the violence committed by it is okay. So he says, therein resides the fundamental systemic violence of capitalism. This violence is no longer attributable to individuals and their evil intentions, but is purely objective, systemic, and anonymous. Again, opaque. I would just challenge you to think about that word violence and think of at least 3 ways that the capitalist system perpetuates violence on people. Again, I'm not saying that other systems do not. In fact, communism very much contends for the worst system that human beings have yet created, by which I mean totalitarian communism, like what we saw in the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. But before we fall into the territory of 2 wrongs make a right, I'd just like to challenge people to think about 3 ways in which capitalism forces people to do things they otherwise would not do, breaks down, dislocates, etc. So then Zizek turns to a critique of sorts of The Wire, but he's really just trying to make his own point, and using The Wire as a way of kind of thinking it through. He says that The Wire ultimately is not able to fully depict a universe in which abstraction reigns, even though the author and the people who conceptualized the TV show were somewhat aware of this and showed the futility of the system, the way that the various elements seem to sort of not be able to fulfill their stated function. Nevertheless, it fights back against that abstraction by focusing in on the individuals and their heroic efforts. And he makes the point that hopeless resistance may be heroic, but also in some ways perpetuates the system or the machine. And he explains that from his point of view, when the characters fight the system to make it better, they are in effect accepting the fundamental legitimacy of the system. And when they do that, they're unable to imagine a different system, or more importantly, to act to create one. There is that one breakout period when they stop persecuting street criminals, which is about as close as any of the characters come in the show to trying to institute a different system. But it is just a reform. It's really not a completely different system at all. It's a reform, a fairly radical one, but a reform of the existing system to make it run more smoothly. So again, his point is that when the characters fight the system, or when I guess we fight the system to make it better, we are in effect legitimizing the system, and perhaps even more than that, making everybody feel as though it's reformable, and therefore avoiding having to think about what we might do radically differently. And of course, that's where Zizek wants to go. He says the only way to stop the system from working is to stop resisting it. But of course, if that were where he ended, we'd be puzzled as to why he thought that that would help at all. And he anticipates that objection and basically states that withdrawal from the system is the condition for a radical act. In other words, the first step is this stance of somewhat a stance of indifference or acceptance of the way things are, and a truly realistic view of the way things are, and becoming uninvested in reform, I guess, would be a fairly practical way to state this. And once you are uninvested in reform, then you're free to imagine more drastic change. And towards the end of this chapter, he brings the figure of Christ back in here. This is something Zizek does. As I've mentioned before, he is an atheist, but he has some appreciation of Christianity. He seems to understand the religion fairly well. And this is the type of statement that if you read enough Zizek, you won't be surprised anymore when you see this type of thing pop up. He says, "Here we should indeed follow Christ as the paradox of the absolute itself, renouncing the standpoint of the absolute and adopting the radically critical stance of a finite agent engaged in a terrestrial struggle." Well, that's kind of complex language. But what he's saying is that Christ was the absolute. According to the Christian religion, Jesus Christ was God. So in the crucifixion, Christ renounced his absolute character. Well, he takes on human death itself, and so he negates himself. And by emptying himself or letting go of himself as the absolute, he literally becomes capable of speaking to man as man and presenting a power-shattering alternative. I think Zizek likes that aspect of what Christ did. So if you haven't watched The Wire, I would recommend doing so. After having not watched it for 2 or 3 years now, I think I'll go back and maybe take another run through it. I think I'd probably get even more out of it now after having read this chapter. Thanks, bye.